welcome to this live interview. This is one of the live interviews we do with Global Net 21 and Enfield Voices with people who've made a difference or who have a campaign idea and who want to engage with a general audience. And today we've got with us Terry Loane, who you can see him with me at the moment and hear speak in a minute. But if you have questions or comments, please type it in the Facebook page with the comments, and that will be great. Anyhow, as I said, we're going to talk about education today because Terry is passionate about education. Lots of people believe that our education system today is not fit for purpose, that it puts teachers under strain, it puts students under strain, and it doesn't give students the aptitude or the skills for the 21st century. There is something desperately wrong with it. And Terry has given a lot of thought to this over a long career, and I'm glad he's here and he's going to talk about it. So let's go to Terry now. Let me ask him, first of all, Terry, you had a long career in education. Can you tell us a bit about your background so the audience knows about you?
Okay, Francis. Well, about half a century ago now, I studied music at university. From there, I went on to be a secondary school music teacher, then an advisory teacher in music, and then I was involved in the management of local authority music centre. I then moved from there to work in adult education. And for the last few years of my career, I worked on an independent, self-employed basis, looking at how we might use technology in education. So I think I can say that I've actually had a very broad experience of working with people in different age groups. I've taught really everybody from preschool children up to postgraduate students and adult learners. We used to call them silver surfers at one time, the older ones. And so I've had quite a broad range of doing that. And I feel that now that I've retired from paid work, I can draw on that very wide range of experiences to look critically at the education world today and to suggest how it might be improved.
Okay, so at one point you were a head of adult education in the London Borough. And when you were there came a point where you really felt dissatisfied with the education system and you said, enough is enough. I really want to get out. I want to do other things. At what point was that? What was the thing that triggered you?
Well, I think there were two things. I mean, the first was really a local issue. If you're in a job like that, better be careful what I say. Yeah, if you're in a job like that and you don't get on with the director of education, then you think about whether it might be better to leave. But on a more general level, my decision to leave came after a point at which the government was, if you like to think of it in this way, tightening a noose of a very reductionist and oversimplistic way of having accountability in education. I mean, I believe in accountability. If we're using public money and if we're delivering a service to the public, we need to be accountable. But the way in which this was done struck me as being absolutely counterproductive. I had no time for it. And I remember thinking, if when inspection comes to this adult education service, we do badly, obviously I will be upset. But if we do well, I won't be pleased because I don't respect the audit and inspection system. So I realized that was a no-win situation, so I left.
So you talk about accountability in education. What do you mean by accountability?
Well, what I don't mean, or what I think we should avoid in accountability, is getting extremely simplistic measures, like, for example, in schools, the number of GCSE grade C passes, or ridiculously reductionist measures of so-called added value. So I don't mean that. And I think one of the problems is that the politicians, in their quest to claim to be accountable, they reduce the whole thing to very simplistic performance measures. So if you say, how should we be accountable and avoid that, then I think what we need to do is to look at what individuals need to learn in order to make their lives feel more fulfilling, and in order to be able to do what is needed for the people they work with. And we need to have narrative ways of describing that. You can't give it a mark out of 10 or a mark out of 100. And if people think you can, then I'm afraid it's as if they're failing to acknowledge the complexity of human achievement. It's a bit like saying, all music composers should be accountable, so we should be able to say whether Mozart was better than Beethoven. It's nonsense. You can't answer that question. And likewise, if you're dealing with something as complex as human learning, human capability, and human achievement, there can be no simple measures.
Okay, so we're not giving students what you think they need in order to fit in with the 21st century and to go out into the wider world. But what is it you think they need?
Okay, well, it's not just that I don't think we're giving them what they need. Just about everybody I speak to agrees. Whether I'm speaking to parents, to young people themselves, to academics, to health professionals, they all use the same words. They all say what we're doing now is not really fit for purpose. And I think what we need to be able to do is to engage the creativity, imagination, enthusiasm of young people, because you see, this is, even if you think in terms of employed work, this is what employers say they want. They want people who can collaborate with each other. They want people who use their imagination. They want people to be creative, and none of these things are tested through the exam system, and the sort of almost total focus on exams means there's no energy for teachers to actually develop these things.
So would you say that you're dissatisfied with the way education was constructed right the way back from the 1944 Act, which was meant to be inclusive for everyone? I mean, has it been inclusive for everyone?
I don't think so. And the reason it's not inclusive, and the reason you ask if I'm dissatisfied right back to the 1944 Education Act. What I would say, though, is that if you look at what's happening now, as opposed to in the 1940s or when I was at school in the 1960s, we need people to be able to do different things. Technology has meant that our relationship with knowledge and skills has utterly changed. So regardless of whether the exam system was okay in the 1940s and 50s, 60s, it is most certainly not okay now. And you see, what's actually happened, Francis, is that politicians have taken us backwards. If you look at the so-called English Baccalaureate, the EBAC, it is an attempt by politicians to put pressure on schools to narrow the curriculum, to remove those things I've just been talking about, the opportunity for creativity and enthusiasm, because it really undervalues the arts. There's no place for arts subjects. They're not listed in the EBAC. And I would say that the EBAC is actually taking the school curriculum right back to what it was when I was at school in the 1960s. You have to do English language, English literature, a foreign language, 2 science subjects, I think, history or geography. Now, there's nothing wrong with any of those things. But when I was back in the secondary classroom, I'm now going back to the 1980s, we were moving away from that. The school I taught at, I think the kids at the age of 14 had to do maths and English. After that, they were given free choice with guidance as to the subjects they would study, and all those choices were put into a computer, and the computer designed the timetable to offer, to satisfy the maximum number of people. But we've moved right away from that, right back from that flexible approach towards a narrow approach. And I believe that the politicians are actually in denial about the changes that technology have brought about in how human beings should relate to knowledge and skills. we need to have difficult conversations, and we haven't had those difficult conversations. For example, should young people learn their times tables? My gut feeling is yes, they should. Should young people learn to write with a pen? My gut feeling is yes, you should. But we have to accept that neither of those things is as vitally important now as it was when I was at school, because we have calculators built into our phones. I like to ask people when it comes to handwriting, I think this is a really difficult thing to talk about. What's the largest number of words you've handwritten to another human being recently? And people they don't write letters anymore. You don't have to fill in forms with long strings of sentences. My record is 10. It went like this. Hope you feel better soon. Love from Terry and Julia. That's the largest number of words I've written with a pen. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't teach children to handwrite. What I am saying is we need to have the difficult conversation rather than just moving back to a model of education from the 1960s.
Okay, I mean, what you're saying reminds me of the title of a book by Paul Godwin, I think it was, called Compulsory Miseducation. And that's the title of his book. I mean, you say in the 1980s, when you taught, there were some very, very few compulsory fixed subjects, and after that there was a lot of choice, and we moved away from that. So what went wrong? Why do you think we moved away from that and then everything became so rigid?
Right. Well, I think I would say we've got to dig deep to look at the reasons, and I think there are three reasons. Denial, which I've just spoken about, ignorance, and political ideology. So the denial is this business that the politicians, and maybe all of us to some extent, are frightened by the changes that technology has made in the world. So our reaction to that fear is to go back and say, oh, well, everything was much more straightforward in the 1950s and 60s. So let's go back to the curriculum then, and everything will be fine. And I really think that psychology is at work. The second thing is ignorance, and I don't use that word lightly. You see, what fascinates me is that all these developments in technology, really, the decade when they really happened was the 1990s in terms of the internet. In 1990, very few people were using the internet. By 2000, we were all using it, more or less. During exactly the same decade, from 1990 to 2000, research into how human beings really learn, I'll come back to explain what I mean by really learn in a minute. Research into how human beings really learn leapt ahead. There were lots of researchers, people like Julian Orr, Jean Lave, Etienne Wenger. They were all looking at how people learn to do the things that they themselves value and that are valued by those with whom they work. And all these strides forward were about social learning, about the fact that learning to do the real things in life, whether it's learning to fit into a new job, whether it's learning to play an instrument in an orchestra, they're all about learning how a group operates. And that social learning, it's been ignored actually by the politicians and also by most people, I think, in school. I mean, people pay lip service to the need to get people to collaborate, but it doesn't actually, it doesn't actually happen in schools because they're obsessed by individual performance and exams.
Okay, so you told us what has gone wrong, but why do you think it's gone wrong? Is it that because there, for example, is a generational gap between those people who teach and those kids and students who learn and are on a different pedagogy and a different technology? Or is it something to do with the corporate structure of our society, or is it something else? Why has it gone wrong?
I think it's gone wrong. Well, as I say, partly due to denial about technology and ignorance of research, but then it's gone wrong because of political ideology. Because there's been an ideological commitment to reducing the size of the state, to shrinking the state, to outsourcing and to privatization. Now, if you outsource or privatize the collection of dustbins, it's quite easy to come up with performance indicators. You can have the number of people who phone up to say their dustbin hasn't been collected or whatever. But if you want to have performance indicators for an outsourced education service, it's much more difficult, because education is about developing the complexity of the human being. And that's quite different to collecting the dustbins. So I believe that what politicians have done in order to enable them to follow through their ideological commitment to outsourcing and privatizing education is they said, well, we must have simple measures so that we can tell, who's doing this best. And those simple measures are exam results, or, they've made it slightly more complicated now in England with the measure called Progress 8, but they're all about measuring what human beings do at a particular age and then putting the same people at a later age all through the same system. So it's about simplicity of measurement, and that is responsible for the huge stress that the exam system puts on people. And I think it's also responsible for the fact that we're not doing in schools what young people need to do and what young people want to do. We're putting them through simplistic exams because they're easy to measure.
So is the exam system and the setting of targets a manifestation of what has gone wrong and why it has gone wrong? And are those the only things, or is it something else? Is it about size, lack of conviviality, the fact that there's too much political and government interference? And there are other factors like that as well.
I think the stranglehold of exams does come back to this idea that you can and should measure the efficiency of schools. I use efficiency in inverted commas, and I think all those other things you mentioned, like conviviality, they just go out the window. Now, I'm not going to glorify what schools were like in the 1970s and 80s when I was teaching in the secondary classroom. There were huge problems then as now, but there was, there was more freedom, there was more flexibility. And I think one thing that we must do, well, I think we should acknowledge that young people, by the time they've become teenagers, they're hugely different from each other in terms of what interests them, what motivates them, what their capabilities are, what their previous experience is. And yet we try to put them all through the same straitjacket. And I think the idea of teaching people in age groups and having a rigid age-related curriculum needs to be dumped from the age of 12. And after that, what we need are much more flexible options and routes for learning.
Okay, so a lot of people will say, and they do on our social network sites very often, they say, what's wrong with education is it's under-resourced. We've got to put more money into it. But what you're saying is you can put all the money in the world, but without these other changes, education will still be bad.
You're absolutely right, Francis. A well-resourced exam factory is still as capable of damaging young people's mental health as a poorly resourced exam factory. And, if we're talking about, I don't, so that's why I don't really want to get into the funding argument, because I think I think it misses the point. But I'll say one thing, if we're really concerned about using educational resources in a cost-effective way, why are our schools locked shut for almost half the days of the year? The school year is 38 weeks, 5 days a week. That's 190 days, and there are 365 days in the year. It's a national disgrace that we lock away all this resource and all this equipment for half the time. And they're only open, for between 9 and 4 or 9 and 3:30 on the days they do operate. It's a scandal. We need to break out of the straitjacket of the school day and the school year. And I can give you examples of how that works successfully. Okay,
well, maybe we can do that in a minute. But you talked about factory exam system, the factory schools. And that's a very good term, because in a way, our education system grew up from the 19th century when the factory system grew up. Yep. And the factory system is breaking down, but it still hasn't broken down in the schools. Now, how do you actually move from this top-down factory approach to a bottom-up approach, which, as you were indicating, could be a very personalized individual by individual education system. How do we make that shift?
Okay, I think the first thing we've got to do, and I mean, this is my personal view of tactics, if you like, but I think the first thing we've got to do is to challenge the stranglehold of the GCSE exams, to challenge the idea that all 16-year-olds should really be taking the same exams with very limited choice. I mean, it's quite mad, really, when you think how different 16-year-olds are, that we should expect all of them to sit down in front of the same maths paper. I mean, I know there are some limited grade options, but nevertheless, that's the overall principle. And I think we need to somehow get away from the requirement that the only way we should report on young people's learning at the age of 16 is through GCSEs. And I believe if we're successful in doing that, that will have a sort of knock-on effect downwards in terms of the age and upwards to university. I think it will, if we get rid of this rigid age-specific narrow curriculum between the age of about 12 and 16, I believe that other things then will be freed up. So I think we need to look at, as I said earlier, at having a much more flexible approach to learning from the age of 12 or 13. And we need to, there are lots of really successful ways of reporting on people's learning. We don't need exams. I mean, just think about the world of art and design. For as long as any of us can remember, the way that you make a judgment about an art and design student isn't about what mark they've got in an exam. You look at their portfolio. I remember my niece a few years ago going to an open day at university for an art and design course, and they actually said, "We don't care about your A-level exams. We want to look at what you can do." Now, the great thing about technology is that portfolio system, you know, the classic huge case that art and design students used to carry around with them, that can now be done electronically and across other subjects, and across other subjects as well. And if there are areas where exams are still appropriate, and I'm sure there are, then we need to take a model from the way music exams have worked. Music exams, for those who don't know about it, there are 8 grades of music exam. Now, I've got my criticisms of the music exam system, but at least people do the exams in music on a when-ready basis. You don't have to do the grade 5 exam at the age of 14 or anything like that. Your teacher will say, "I think you can play pieces at this level convincingly. Do this exam now." And I think, it's the same as the driving test. You do it, not at a particular age. You do it when you're ready to do it.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. Well, I mean, you're getting some people coming up, putting comments, and a lot of people are in agreement with you. You can see that Frances Gray, for example, has said she's taught for a number of years. She's had to fill in 13 forms. Nothing, they were useless and nothing to do with teaching or learning. So in a way, she's agreeing with you on that. And you've had people like Stuart saying great discussion and so on. So I think, you're getting quite a lot of people out there who really do agree with you. I mean, do you have any examples of how education should be? I mean, for example, we've done meetings on Finland and their system, and we've done meetings on self-organized learning, which Sugata Mitra was involved in Newcastle, where he teaches at the university, and the work he did in India. I mean, would you have any examples like that you'd want to give?
Yeah, I mean, Finland is often quoted as a good example, but actually, if we need to see how my ideas will work, we don't need to look any further than the UK. Because if you were to ask the question, what's been the most successful aspect of education in the United Kingdom in my lifetime, since the Second World War, a few years earlier, I would say, and I've never found anybody to disagree with me on this, that the thing which has been was unequivocally successful was musical instrument teaching and music ensembles, bands and choirs run by local authorities in the UK during the last 30 years of the 20th century, more or less 1970 until 2000. And that was phenomenally successful in terms of the standards of music achieved at every level, in terms of the enthusiasm of kids. You know, when I ran the Saturday morning music centre, every Saturday I used to think, why are these 400 kids coming here? They could be lying in bed. And now, you know, so it's a hugely successful thing. Unfortunately, it's crumbling now, but it was very successful. And if we look at what made it successful, I think that's a model for how all learning should be after the age of 12 or 13. First of all, it broke out of the barriers of the school day. Within schools, you see, the music activities tended to happen at lunchtime or after school. Outside of the schools, if you look at the local area level, things happened on a Saturday morning, as I've just mentioned, or on weekday evenings. So it broke out of the ridiculous confines of the school day. Music also broke out of the ridiculous confines of the 38-week academic year, because music courses tended to happen at holidays, and kids would go and play in an orchestra or sing in a choir or play in a band during the school holidays. So it broke outside of those limitations. It broke outside of the ridiculous idea that all the 13-year-olds should learn together and all the 14-year-olds should learn together. You joined a group when you were ready to play in that group. So you'd have a certain mix of ages. It also involved young people having choice over what they did. And interestingly, you know, sometimes people suggest to me that I'm not being rigorous enough, but actually the rigor and the commitment involved in musical performance is second to nothing. You know, young people would realize that if they were practicing for a concert or whatever, they had to turn up, and they realized that they would let their friends down if they didn't turn up. So you get this huge pride and reliability and commitment. And finally, we managed to do all of this without any school uniform.
I'm in favour of that. I can remember always taking my cap off and getting told off for doing that by the teachers. I hated it. Okay, I mean, we're getting close to the end of time.
May I just say one additional thing? Sorry, but I meant just following on from that idea of the music centres. What we need for people over the age of 12, rather than fixed schooling, is we need music centres, we need math centres, we need foreign language centres, we need skateboarding centres, we need maker centres where they can make things. And that's the sort of flexibility that we need. And music, the way we did music, and it still carries on in some places, although not to the same extent, that's the model of what we should be doing, and it works.
Okay, so you're talking about having different centres as a way of growing education and allowing people to have choice. You talked about new technology, and you know, the example of self-organised learning is where kids have been using computers and have learned much faster than they did in the classroom. And we looked at all those things. Now, I know change has got to take place at the government level, but the last question to give you, if you can make a brief answer, is how do you think we can move from where we are now to where you want to be? And what can local authorities do, given the constraints they're under, to achieve that?
It's not primarily a question for local authorities anymore. I mean, their influence has been hugely reduced in the last 50 years, local education authorities. It will happen if and when parents start saying, we're not going to put up with this stupid GCSE system anymore, and we're not going to put up with the mental ill health that system is forcing onto our young people. And unless parents say that, nothing will improve. So, in a way, the groundswell for change has got to come from citizens and parents. And how would you encourage that? And how would you facilitate that? Well, hopefully by doing interviews like this in a small way. I mean, I actually think that we must be near a tipping point, because as I think I said earlier, absolutely everybody I speak to agrees that the GCSE exam-based system is not fit for purpose. You know, I spoke to one parent of a young woman and she's fantastically keen on dance. That's her thing, but she doesn't have a mathematical way of thinking. She did her GCSE maths, you know, earlier on this year, and she'll be getting the results next week. And you know, I think it was a very difficult situation for that young girl. Now, parents realise this is happening. I was talking to somebody, a neighbour yesterday, who said what should be happening in schools is much more practical. It's far too theoretical. Everybody's ready for this. And if you say, how do we get a campaign going? Well, I don't have any clear, clever answers to that, but we need to raise awareness.
Okay.
Sorry,
right.
We don't need to raise the awareness is there. We need to raise commitment to the awareness, as it were.
Okay. The phone's going, just ignore that. Okay, so we sort of come to the end of that, and you sort of remind me of Charles Handy's view that there are 7 types of intelligence and the schools only cater for one, the academic one, and that's sort of interesting in itself. Okay, so we've sort of come to the end of that, and thank you for doing that, Terry, because that was a really interesting interview, and I think lots of people will have learned a lot from that and want to take it forward. Can I just say to people, we are carrying this discussion on, and on October the 9th, I've put it up on the screen now, on October the 9th, we've got a meeting in the House of Commons with Sugata Mitra, who has developed the self-organized learning environment. And it's a House Commons meeting. And if you go to our meetup site, you can sign on to that. It's not posted up yet, but it should be posted up in the next couple of days. So if you'd like to go to that, you can join us and we can carry on with that particular discussion. Okay, so thank you all for joining us. Thank you for the questions and the remarks you put up. And thank you again for doing that, Terry. That was really interesting.
Thank you, Francis.
So we'll end this interview now.